as some of us know, Mexican philosophy, and I think Latin American philosophy more broadly, is often connected in different ways to stories and narratives and poetry, right? There's lots of great examples of this coming from the tradition. And so I thought that I would ask Carlos and Amy if you could tell us the story of how you initially became interested in this area of philosophy, and kind of after that initial spark, what's kept you going?
You want to go first, Amy, or should I go?
You go first. You're on.
The way that I came into Mexican philosophy was not inevitable, right? Because there was no sense that such a tradition existed when I first encountered philosophy, or academic philosophy, which was sometime in my sophomore or junior year of college. That's when I first discovered that there was such a thing as the opportunity to study philosophy in any serious way. And so there was nobody talking about Mexican philosophy or any other tradition except Western philosophy in a very traditional sense. And so I went ahead and I just continued my path. I fell in love with philosophy. I just started studying, and I started to get into different topics. I discovered the philosopher Ortega y Gasset, Jose Ortega y Gasset, and I really fell in love with what he was saying and the way that he was saying it. And then I was surprised to learn that he wasn't white, right? Or a white in the sense of the other philosophers that I was studying. But I was also surprised to learn that he wasn't Mexican, which I remember having a conversation with a professor who was telling me, like, well, if you're really interested in finding Mexican philosophers, you're probably going to have to go look for them yourself. And so I didn't. I went and got a PhD and doing a dissertation on Edmund Husserl and phenomenology. And it wasn't until I was done with a dissertation that I started asking myself whether or not there was philosophers in Mexico that were doing this kind of thing. And that's when I ran into two articles that really kind of changed my academic life from then on. And that was, the first one was by Antonio Sirion Quijano, who had written an article on phenomenology in Mexico in the 20th century. And it was a very introductory article published in Continental Philosophy Review. And he mentioned some figures there without really telling us what they said. He just said, okay, these are the guys. And then the other article that I ran into was Amy's, where she was talking about values in Mexican philosophy. And then I realized, okay, you know what? I never had the opportunity to study Mexican philosophy as an undergrad. I think I'm going to dedicate my time and effort to making sure that other people do, especially other people like me who are kind of thrown into philosophy and told that this is all there is, right? So from now on, I was going to try to make this option available to other people. So that's how I came into it, and I've been waddling my way through this whole time.
Thanks, Carlos. And before bouncing the ball over to Amy, I should also add, I think, for people who are tuning in who might be kind of unfamiliar with academic philosophy, that for many folks who are teaching academic philosophy today, or Mexican philosophy today, many of us didn't have opportunities to take like a proper Mexican philosophy course, which is usually kind of the path that people follow, right? In grad school, you take that one seminar and then you write your dissertation and you're an expert. But for folks working in Mexican philosophy and in other kind of epistemically marginalized areas, you kind of have to do this work on your own. And I think that Carlos's story really reflects that. And that's really interesting. And I'm eager to hear what Amy has to say about her own journey.
Sure. Well, I was first drawn to the fascinating world of Mexico itself as a child. I spent a lot of my childhood there, and I grew up in a bilingual, bicultural environment. So I wasn't aware of philosophy until probably when I was in high school, and it was in Mexico that I became aware of it. I knew that students there, my age, were studying philosophy in high school. And I know that they found it challenging. And I thought, well, that's good that I don't have to study that in the US because, I don't need one more thing to add to my homework. And then I noticed that in the newspapers, of which there were quite a few, that on the op-ed pages, there were often long essays, and some of them dealt with philosophy, and they were really long, sometimes 2 whole pages. And so I wondered why that was the case. But I didn't wonder too much about that. But when I got to college, where I began studying pharmacy, of all things, I was reading the student newspaper one day, and I noticed that there was a professor who had just returned from Mexico, where he had had a Guggenheim Fellowship. And I was very interested in what he was quoted as saying about Mexico. And I thought, gee, how come I've never heard of these people? And, I spent a lot of time there. So I went to his office hours and visited with him and learned a whole lot at that meeting. And he encouraged me to take a course with him. So I did that. And I first learned about Mexican philosophy before any other kind of philosophy. And then later in college, I took a couple more courses on what we would now call Western philosophy, the more traditional type things.
Thanks so much, Amy. I was totally unaware of that backstory. It's so interesting to hear how kind of your experiences growing up in Mexico inspired this kind of lifelong passion for Mexican philosophy. Thank you for sharing. The next question, perhaps getting a little bit more technical. So both of you, Carlos and Amy, you've done very important work delving into some rich conceptual frameworks in Mexican philosophy, right? So some examples, work on zozobra and nepantlismo and existentialism, right? Well, delving into terms and coining new terms as well. And so I was wondering if you could maybe pick, one or two of these concepts that you've worked on and explain them to our listeners. And if you'd like, maybe talk about how these concepts, these frameworks can help us in our day-to-day lives, if you'd like to go in that direction. So yeah, I thought that would be my next question.
Go ahead, Amy. You go.
Oh, no, Carlos, I think you should begin because you've just finished a book in which you're going to lay out some of these concepts. So why don't you start, and maybe I could follow up with a couple footnotes or real life uses for these things.
Okay, yeah, fine. Well, one of the concepts that I think it's most interesting to me, and the subject of my first book, The Suspension of Seriousness, which I published in 2012, is the concept of relajo, right? And now relajo is a term that could be easily translated as to relax, right? Or and is used in various places as a way to talk about having lackadaisical attitude, or being unburdened by concerns and such. Now, Jorge Portilla, the Mexican philosopher Jorge Portilla, wrote a book called La Fenomenología del Relajo. And that was the first book that I encountered when I finished my dissertation, and that really kind of got me into deciding that I needed to do a lot of translation. And the concept of relajo is an interesting one for me because I still haven't really gotten a grasp on it. It continues to defy me. Right? Now, when I published my translation, I left it untranslated. The concept of relajo, I could not translate it because you can literally go into the dictionary and find this literal translation. But that's not what the philosopher Portilla meant by relajo. It's not what the dictionary says. What he meant by relajo was he meant a suspension of seriousness, right? So relajo is defined as a suspension of seriousness, and to me that's it's a very useful concept. especially for us today, right? Because there seems to be either too much seriousness or not enough of it. And so when we put the concept to work, right, we can define we can find events or situations where seriousness is absolutely needed. Whatever the situation may be, a political rally or a classroom atmosphere or something like that. And you need seriousness in that moment. Relajo is going to be the complete interruption of that seriousness. When things turn into chaos and all of a sudden the event that you were in, the situation that you were in, is no longer what it had to be. And to me, that's an interesting concept that Portilla thinks really defines Mexican culture in the 1940s and 50s. He thinks that the reason why Mexicans and Mexico are kind of stuck in a historical quicksand is because they can't seem to take things as seriously as he would like them to be taken. And that's because they suffer, he says, from this condition of relajo. He sees it as like a negative thing, right? Where you can get stuck in the suspension of values and not really doing what you are being asked to do by the situation, by history, by society, and so on and so forth. Now, when I first started thinking about this concept, I could imagine all the parties, all the fiestas that I went to as a kid and as a teenager, where really, after all the alcohol and all the music and all the partying, you have suspended all values, suspended seriousness, and you are now just in this kind of limbo, chaotic state where you're just literally just having fun. Right? But for Portilla, this is not conducive to any sort of progress, historical or social progress. And so to me, that's a really interesting concept that philosophers could really get into, sink their claws into, and also a concept that could help us think about culture more generally today. Now, the reason why I say that I still haven't really gotten a grasp on it is because I've come to think that relajo is not that bad. Right? It's not as bad as Portilla kind of makes it out to be. A suspension of seriousness is not necessarily the end of the world, right? It's I think that in our contemporary situation, suspending values even for a little bit is actually a positive thing. It can be a moment of liberation, a moment of freedom, where we can step back from the demands of seriousness and do our own thing, be free, do nothing, or completely just allow the unseriousness to kind of take us over. So I'm still not sure what I think of this concept, but I think that it's applicable and useful to describe our contemporary situation, and also to take it into the classroom and have students kind of think about it. I think that they would really have a lot of fun with it. So that's one concept that I think is interesting.
Thanks, Carlos. That's so interesting, both your analysis of Portilla, but also kind of the way in which you're critically assessing it. Maybe there, do you think, is there good relajo and bad relajo? Can relajo be conducted in different ways that are good or bad?
I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm trying to think, right? I think that we like to think a lot about so basically the framework in which we find relajo is a conversation about values, and Portilla says that values demand things from us, right? So that when we step into a situation, let's say that we're reading a particular text, the way that the text is written, the context of the text, the history of the text is going to tell us how to read it, right? And we have to respect that, right? We have to respect those demands. And so in that way, I think that Portilla has a very orthodox way to approach the life, right? Okay, just follow the rules kind of thing, and you'll be okay. And so, and I think, well, maybe there's a way in which you can approach a text, whether it's the Bible or Harry Potter or whatever, and approach it in a way that's not answering its demands, right? And in that way, you could really just be free in your interaction with it. I mean, I could even, I don't like saying this, but I thought about it, like, there's a sort of a decolonial elements to relajo that I don't think Portilla would agree with, but I think that it's worth exploring. This idea that, yeah, there is a sense in which you could detach yourself from the demands of the values of situations or things, and approach them in a different way, or not approach them at all. Right? It's a way to kind of cut yourself off from those demands. So yeah, there's still work to be done, and that's why I really like this concept, because I think that it has a good future.
Thank you. And Amy, do you want to respond to Carlos on relajo, or maybe talk about a different conceptual framework that you thought about?
You had mentioned zozobra and nepantla specifically, so I thought I would just touch on those because they're also very interesting concepts. Zozobra, very briefly, is a kind of emotional restlessness or unsettledness that one can feel, that Mexicans often feel. And there's a sense of oscillation, of a pendular rhythm to life, where you could be in a good place and realize that perhaps something bad is going to happen. You can be in a bad place and then swing back to a better place. It's generally viewed as a negative concept, but there's a way in which it can be experienced positively. Emilio Uranga talks about grasping both ends of the chain and kind of holding tension or holding contradictions, like you would hold a chain tautly between your hands. So in this sense, I think it can be useful to know that it's okay to embrace contradiction and to realize that anything can happen, that you can have a good day or a bad day, and many other options are out there. So with that's just a very brief overview of it, but with nepantla, that pretty much means in-betweenness, a feeling that one is in the middle, sometimes even stuck in the middle, where you're between two things. And a couple of fun facts about Nepantla are that there is a town called Nepantla, southeast of Mexico City, in the foothills of the volcanoes, where Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz was from, the 17th century Mexican philosopher and poet. Another interesting thing about it is that the term goes back to the Aztecs, and they had an additional sense of motion that they attached to it as another connotation. And one example would be marriage and sexual commingling. For those things to happen, people had to move to the middle, right? They couldn't stay where they were. They had to join together by moving to the middle. So, but in general, it means in betweenness, betwixt and between. So, so Mexicans experience these things, and some say that, well, even those who have who see themselves as securely positioned and emotionally settled should realize that these things exist, right? Because being securely positioned, emotionally settled, those are illusory, right? It might be what people seek, but those are not fixed states. So Mexicans are they more readily accept this idea, and they know how to handle randomness and uncertainty. And I think that is what one of the things that US Americans and other non-Mexicans can learn from Mexican philosophy, is that it's okay to really think deeply about contradiction and about zozobra, or the possibility that bad things can happen. US Americans may have become closer to understanding the concept by the pandemic, right? That was so earth-shattering for people, right? That things could change in our lives so profoundly that I think they realized that the certainty that they thought they had was not really there. And we can imagine other things too, wildfires, floods, earthquakes, whatever's going to happen next could really displace where you think you are. So I think they're very useful concepts for non-Mexicans as well.
Thank you, Amy. Your comments inspired a follow-up question for me, but they also lead so nicely into my next question. So I think I'm going to go to the next question, which is about this question or problem of definition in Mexican philosophy, right? So there's a lot of work in Mexican philosophy and in Latin American philosophy that can be described as metaphilosophical, right? So what is it exactly? The philosophy of the philosophy itself. And Amy, you were talking about, what can be learned from Mexican philosophy. I wanted to ask both of you, I guess, two questions that, in the spirit of zozobra and Nepantla are a bit in contradiction with one another. I'll just throw that out there. But the first is, how do you go about defining Mexican philosophy? But the second question, which is related, but perhaps kind of contradicts the spirit of the first one, is, should we as philosophers be pursuing that question, right? Is the very attempt to define Mexican philosophy, is that inevitably kind of a Eurocentric gatekeeping act? Or can we have kind of a healthy decolonizing conversation about kind of the meta philosophy of Mexican philosophy?
Well, I'll start on that one. I think that, that's a really good question. I got really annoyed in the 2000s by the conversation surrounding the possibility of Latin American philosophy. There was all these discussions about, is Latin American philosophy possible? And that to me was really an annoying question. And it was annoying because I agreed with Zia that the fact that you're asking the question already points to the fact that it exists, right? It's at least to me, and it also annoyed me because I thought, well, that's kind of presumptuous, right? Because why are you asking that question? Why aren't we not asking? If we're asking that question, we could easily ask, is Western philosophy possible? Is Greek philosophy possible, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So it's just an annoying question. I tried to answer it a few times in some of the books that I wrote, but very quickly, and the anthology that Robert Sanchez and I put together in 2017 with Oxford University Press, Mexican Philosophy in the 20th Century, is that what's called? We spent the introduction trying to answer that question, like, what is Mexican philosophy? And in reality, I don't think that there's a really good definition out there. The way that I think about Mexican philosophy is that it is obviously some sort of offshoot of Western philosophy, necessarily so, because of colonialism, imperialism, and all these other relations. So yes, it is an offshoot of Western philosophy. But once it gets to Mexico and it starts to deal with, and Mexican philosophers start to deal with problems related to their own world, to their own realities, I think it takes on a different sense, a different profile, and it becomes a philosophy that's engaged with the circumstance. And I know that might be an unsatisfactory definition of Mexican philosophy, but I think that that's what it is, right? It's when we get to the 20th century, it is a philosophy that is trying desperately to find the meaning of what it means to be Mexican, of what history means, of what circumstance means, of what all those things imply. So it's and there's a quote in the Gorgias, Plato's dialogue, where he defines philosophy as and says that philosophy shouldn't be too concerned with the particulars, right? And I think that by the time that philosophy gets to Mexico in the 20th century, which is the period that Amy and I both kind of focus on, that's exactly what it's doing, right? It wants to focus on the particulars. It wants to focus on the circumstance, on a particular people, on a particular time, and I think that's valuable in and of itself. It's a valuable approach to philosophy. It's a healthy way to approach philosophy, and it models. It's also a model for us, like for myself, to try to think of what it means to be me in the United States in the 21st century, right? So I think that it's a good way to kind of think about philosophy as circumstantial, and rooted, and situational, and all of those things. So in terms of a definition, I'm not sure that one could be properly given, but I don't know. Maybe Amy has.
No, I don't have a definition per se. I would say that, you referenced the kind of philosophy that we have worked on. There are many other kinds of philosophy being done in Mexico, and there have been panels and lots of articles over the years about, is Mexican philosophy about philosophy with a particularly Mexican character, or is it just about philosophy done in Mexico, or what all does it encompass? And lots of back and forth about this. And I came to be of the opinion that I felt that sort of Mexican existence was being questioned. It was sort of like, if is there really a Mexican philosophy? I thought that was sort of an underlying question. And so I think that I'm more toward I favor the latter part of your question, Amy, that I think it's not that useful to try to define it. I mean, maybe eventually there will be a better definition than we're giving today, but I would go with the Nike slogan, just do it. I mean, it's more like riding a bike. You can read about it, you can watch people do it, but you're going to learn better if you just ride the bike and fall off a few times and get back on. You'll then ride the bike. So people who ask a lot about the definition of it, or the methodology of it, and so on, I think they're missing the mark maybe about what it really is. It's about our lived experience. So and also about how we should be open to the lived experience of others and pay attention to that. So I think that it's better to just delve in.
Yeah, no, I'll say one more thing. I think that the philosophers that I find really fascinating, for instance, Jorge Portilla, Emilio Uranga, Rosario Castellanos, Luis Villoro, these philosophers were trying to figure out their own place in the world, right? But also their own place in the world that had in their own place in a Western world, right? And I think that that's an important qualification, right? Because I think that it would be very intimidating to try to be a philosopher in Mexico in the 1940s, knowing that you have to prove yourself somehow, right? In the eyes of the French and the German and everything. But there was this fearlessness in Mexican philosophy in the 1940s and 50s, where they decided that, we're just going to do this, as Amy said, right? We're just going to do this, this philosophy, and whatever comes out is going to be Mexican philosophy. And so I think that even for us today, for us that are interested in teaching it and writing about it and talking about it, that's our motto too. That's what we do. That we just talk about it and spend as little time as possible trying to, put down a definition, because then we won't have time to talk about the other people.
Thank you so much to you both for those rich responses. And I should let, if folks are wondering, well, Amy Reed-Sandoval, why did you ask this question that clearly annoyed both of your fellow panelists? I just want to put out there that folks working in this area, folks working in Mexican philosophy, have to do the work of, do the philosophy itself, but there's also this need to be kind of justifying the work, right, within the academy. And so I wanted to give Carlos and Amy the opportunity to talk about this kind of additional burden that's placed upon folks who are working in this interesting area. I thought I'll end with one final question, because I know that that others are going to want to ask some questions on themselves. Carlos, you talked about Mexican philosophers, kind of engaging with their social world, understanding themselves in a particular embedded social context. Amy, you also talked about spending time in Mexico, kind of growing up as a child or adolescent, and seeing these op-eds published by philosophers in the local papers that were very long, and that's, I think, probably striking to some of our listeners. I wanted to end by moving this in a somewhat more applied direction. Both of you have also written about contemporary social problems in Mexico, and you've analyzed them using the tools of Mexican philosophy. A couple of examples: Carlos's work on narco culture, Amy, your work on Latin American feminist movements. I was wondering if perhaps each of you could select a social issue in Mexico, a salient social issue in Mexico that you've thought about and written about, and talk about it, explain it to listeners using the philosophical tools from Mexican philosophy that the both of you are most inspired by. So maybe, Amy, if you want to go first, and then jump back to Carlos.
Okay, so Mexican feminist philosophy is rich and indeed has a long history if we point to Juana Inés de la Cruz in the 17th century with her important work. I have worked more on contemporary Mexican feminism, and I think the thing to say there is that the way in which it's social and political philosophy is that Mexican feminists often place a greater concern on violence, questions of development, and domestic work. And so a lot of what they write about differs in those ways, but they're also very engaged with sort of global discussions, the latest theories and so on around the globe. I think the issue now that really at least preoccupies me is the phenomena of pleasure kidnappings, femicide, the high rate of murder of women in Mexico. I think the latest I've read is about 11 women per day. Obviously, that's more than anybody would like to know about, but or would like to have happen, I should say. So I think that the ways in which feminist philosophers in Mexico address these problems, tackle them, and at the same time often try to engage in social movements, social action to do something about these problems is a little bit different from what you find in academic philosophy elsewhere.
I'm also very interested in issues of immigration. The book on narco-culture that I published in 2020 was motivated by this idea that there's multiple pressing concerns that we should be thinking about, and in the spirit of Mexican philosophy, I was going to tackle one of them that's directly related to my circumstances as a Mexican American in the United States. But another topic that I'm really interested in is immigration. One of the things that I've done, as you know, Amy, is that I've tried to look at the immigration through the lens of Mexican philosophy by trying to define the experience of immigration using concepts that we find in Mexican philosophy. So I was talking about in an article that I published in response to your book. I was talking about how for my father, coming to the United States was not an ideal situation. He didn't want to come to the United States. He didn't want to immigrate from Michoacan, Mexico to California, but he had to. He needed to do this because there was no other option for life where he was. So once he was here in the United States, he had no other option but to work hard for 50 years. And the moment that he stopped working, he went back. Right? There was at no point in his mind was it settled that he was going to come to the United States and live here and replace somebody. Right? He was going to come to the United States and work, and then once he was done working, he was going to go back. That was his mission. That was his goal. And so using some of the concepts of Mexican philosophy, I was able to kind of capture that experience using the concept of, for instance, of Nepantla, this idea that he was in the United States and he was never really here. Right? He was always on the way back, right? And even though he spent decades here, he was always on the way back. Every morning was a step to return. Right? And so Sobra, this idea that he always felt unease in being here, raising us even, right? There was always this unease about settling and growing roots. So Sobra describes that experience for him. So I think that the tools that we find in Mexican philosophy are very useful to understand the immigrant experience even today, right? Because it allows us to see that, for me at least, it allows me to see that for many immigrants coming to the United States, the United States is not the final destination. It's a midway point between beginnings, between origins, right? They come here, but they have to, and then they want to go back to where they are from. And so I mean, that was definitely the experience of my father. This idea that he used to tell me all the time that his belly button, when he was born, they cut his umbilical cord and they buried it under a tree in Michoacan. And he liked to describe that experience as being tethered to that tree. Right? So no matter how far he left, how far he went from Michoacan, whether it was California or Japan, he was always tied to that tree via his umbilical cord. And so to me, Mexican philosophy allows us to kind of think this experience in a different, more, you could even say poetic way, but one that's true to the experience.
Thank you so much, Carlos and Amy. I could spend just hours asking you questions and listening to your fascinating answers, but I know others want their chance to ask questions as well. And I think Anthony was going to field some questions from the audience to keep the conversation going.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Let's just get cracking straight away. There's quite a number of questions that have come in. I thought I'd start with two separate ones from Tony Herrera, partly because it picks up on something that was just talked about. So Tony asked, firstly, how much is Mexican philosophy influenced by Mexican artists and revolution of the early 20th century? And secondly, can you speak more to the political project of Mexican philosophy? So Amy, would you do either of those questions resonate with you, or both of them? Anything you want to say on them?
Sure. Definitely the post-revolutionary period in Mexico was a flourishing time for the arts. As Amy R. mentioned earlier, you find philosophy in other formats than just the traditional philosophical essay, in short stories, novels, and so on, theater. So that was really a burgeoning phenomenon in Mexico after the revolution, particularly 30s, 40s, and 50s. So let's see, I think the question was how much does that have to do with it? I mean, I do think there was sort of a general upswing in humanities culture rather than canceling humanities as we see going on in the US now. We saw a flourishing of all forms of the humanities. And so philosophy began to be done in a more professional way, began to be taken more seriously in terms of a professional field. So there definitely, I would say, was a relationship between the arts and philosophy, and they mutually benefited one another. As to a political focus, I think there's not so much a political agenda, unless you want to talk about liberation philosophy, but there's more of just a tendency to focus on social and political philosophy because, as Carlos mentioned, circumstance is extremely important in terms of a starting point for doing philosophy in Mexico.
Thank you, Amy. Carlos, would you like to pick up on either of Tony's questions or anything Amy said in response?
Well, I mean, a clear example of the relationship between art and philosophy is given by the Ateneo de la Juventud, which was this founding group of young Mexican philosophers and artists before the revolution, around 1907 or so. And these artists and philosophers and poets work together, right, to try to return or reinvigorate the Mexican spirit earlier in the 20th century. And out of that group, you have people like Diego de Rivera and Orozco and all of these other guys, and also the philosophers that basically, for me at least, founded 20th century Mexican philosophy, which is José Vasconcelos and Antonio Caso. Now, yes, I think that it's always a very it's been an assumption that Latin American philosophy in general has a very political bent, and I think that's true in a lot of cases. But in Mexico, I think that especially in the period in the 20th century that I'm interested in, the politics took a backseat to dealing with just culture, right? and history, to be more philosophical in that traditional sense. Now, towards the end of the 20th century, one of the a very interesting episode takes place with Luis Villoro, who was one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. He begins to talk more and more about politics, and he associates and aligns himself with the Zapatistas, and engages in this very productive and very interesting dialogue with Marcos, Subcomandante Marcos, in the early part of the 21st century. That Tony or anybody else is interested, you can probably find that online. But yeah, so there is this relationship. Of course, it exists, but I think that it's not primary. Yeah.
Thank you. Amy R., any comments on any of this, or would you like us to move on?
Just to very, very quickly follow up on something that Carlos just said. I just thought I would, for those who are not familiar with what's happening in the news right now in Mexico, I just thought that I would throw out there that there's been kind of rumblings within the Zapatista movement very recently. And so for those who are interested in Zapatismo and its relationship to philosophy, that would be an interesting current event for people to look into right now.
Thank you, Amy. So there's loads of questions. I thought I would ask this one from Dave. So Dave, I think you must have read your essay, Carlos, on Mexican ontology, because he says you offer rich reflections on the quality of Nepantla as a kind of in-betweenness as part of Mexican identity. And you contrast that to the essentialist character and, quote, arrogant sufficiency of today's dominant Western and white European conception of philosophy. So Dave goes on to note that in the symposium, Plato himself speaks of philosophy as having a character of betweenness, between appearance and reality, with love as a kind of transport that can help us realize truth and beauty. So Dave's asking whether you see your work in certain ways as a move in the direction of this earlier understanding of philosophy as characterized by its Nepantla status, between appearance and reality.
No, I mean, I had not thought about that, but I think I'm going to steal that and say that that's how you should understand it. Yeah, I think that, I mean, just to skirt the question a little bit and answer my own here, I really think that philosophy, if we understand it in this way as a Nepantla philosophy, allows us to be more free in the topics that we choose, and the way that we approach them, and the conclusions that we arrive at, and the language that we use to describe things. And to me, that's valuable, right? It allows us to do more with philosophy. I mentioned, and Amy also mentioned, this book that I wrote in 2020 on narcoculture. The narcoculture, it's not generally a topic of philosophers, and I gave myself the liberty of talking about it, because I felt that it was an interesting and necessary topic to talk about. And the reason why I gave myself the liberty is because I was inspired by Mexican philosophy, by what Mexican philosophers were doing in the 20th century. And so yeah, I like this idea of moving between spaces and places, and philosophy, and allowing philosophy to be that transit.
Thank you. So I thought, in order to get as many questions in the few remaining minutes, I just, instead of asking for Amy's response, I just put another question to Amy, and then it's a question that I think has been sort of touched on, but maybe the specific focus hasn't been addressed. So it's asking about the relationship between the particular, in other words, this is Alice, the Mexican part of Mexican philosophy, and the universal, i.e. the philosophy part, at least if we understand that as what philosophy is attempting to do. So Alice's question is, what is the relationship of Mexican philosophy to claims of universality? I mean, it's a big question, but you may have some thoughts on that.
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. I think that a lot of Mexican philosophers, including, for example, Leopoldo Sea, would say that it's important to begin with your own circumstance, your own surroundings, to understand those as best you can. So in his case, he began with what was going on in Mexico, and with these discussions of Mexicanidad. What is it? What is lo mexicano? What's essential, or what's problematic, or what's helpful about being Mexican? So ontological concerns and some epistemological concerns. But then he believed very strongly in building knowledge as concentric circles. So he moved on from Mexico to Latin America generally, because he thought it would be helpful to understand what other philosophers throughout Latin America were thinking about, what concerns did they have, and see what connections or enhancements could be made between Mexico and Latin American philosophers. Then he went from there to the developing world, traveled to Africa and Asia, and learned about concerns there. So he just kept expanding. But his contention was that to be universal, something really would need to be applicable to all human beings. So how would we know if something is applicable to all human beings, right? traveling through space and time, as Carlos likes to do, aside, that's a pretty difficult, tall order, right? So I think there's a real questioning of universality and objectivity as concepts. So, so the particular is important, and one can keep building in concentric circles, trying to get toward the universal, but how would we know that we ultimately get there? And I think the critique that many Mexican philosophers make is that the French and the Germans and the Greeks just happen to get positioned favorably first. And so what they do is maybe not that different from what Mexican philosophers do. Mexican philosophers might reach different conclusions, but as Leopoldo Sea said, you know, how come it was okay for Aristotle to wear Greek sandals or 18th century German shoes, but not to wear Mexican huaraches, Mexican sandals? How come those wouldn't fit him? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Amy. So we're pretty much out of time. I mean, there have been a number of specific questions about couple on relajo and one on zozobra and one on existentialism. I just thought I'd finish by putting a question to Carlos, because I think it plays to this kind of ambiguity he was touching about. So this is from Andreas, who asks, isn't the election of Donald Trump as the president of the US an example of the dark side of relajo, when traditional forms of seriousness in the political realm are undermined? I don't know if you think of Donald Trump in terms of relajo, but anyway, that was a question that came.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's a really good observation, right? It's it is it. In a way, I think it is. You know, it's there's obviously the dark side to relajo that Portilla was kind of pinpointing. Now, it's one of the things that I've said in the books that I published is, and I've made this clear there, is that relajo cannot be a decolonial strategy on its own, right? Because one of the things about relajo is that it has a very finite temporality, right? It has a finite time, and you see this. So I'll give you a quick little story, and then I'll shut up. But when I was in school in the 7th grade, I was in a history class, and I had a professor, a history teacher, who used to dress up in a tie all the time. And then one Friday he showed up. We were supposed to learn about the 100 Years War, and he showed up wearing a Waylon Jennings T-shirt. Now, if you don't know who Waylon Jennings is, he's a country singer. And he showed up, you know, as it was Casual Friday or something, and he looked really weird because he usually wore a tie and a white shirt. And then one of the students, he out of nowhere, the teacher was talking about the 100 Years War, and the student raised his hand and he said, "Is it true that Waylon Jennings slept with your wife?" And the teacher turned around. He was mad. He was angry, and he was red in the face. And then all of a sudden, everything stopped. We didn't get to learn about the 100 Years War. We didn't get to learn any more history that day because the teacher was so upset with the student asking him that question. Because what it did is that it completely interrupted everything. Everybody was talking about this Waylon Jennings. People were wondering, who the hell is Waylon Jennings? And you know, it was all these jokes and ruckus and everything, and he made us put our heads down and read the entire class. That's an example of relajo. Now, the next day, we showed up and we had to learn about the 100 Years War, right? We had to go back to history. We had to go back and learn, right? So relajo happens like that. Usually, that's how it happens. It has a temporal dimension, right? Like it only lasted for that test period. And usually the Lajo events last only for the amount of time where the interruption is taking place. So we can't use relajo to like upend traditional values for a long period of time. And so I don't know, that question of Donald Trump is an interesting, right? Because then we would have to define time, and we have to define the interruption that it caused and the values that were inverted. So yeah, I think it's an interesting way, and that's why I think that this concept has a future, right? It has a future in philosophy because we can talk about it and apply it to case stuff. But yeah, so that's my story.
Thank you, Carlos. So Amy R, as the poser of the questions today, do you have any final comments? I thought I'd give you the opportunity if you had anything, just to offer any final thoughts on Mexican philosophy or anything that came up today to close the event. Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
Oh, wow. No, I didn't realize that I would have the last word here. Well, I think I'll just close by saying, I think that this was in the spirit of things that Amy and Carlos said, that this is such an interesting area where there's a lot of space for great work to be done, in terms of writing the philosophy and exploring the concepts, but also applying them to our lives. I think that both panelists have us thinking about zozobra and relajo and nefantismo, and I think that I would just end on this optimistic note of really encouraging folks to learn more about Mexican philosophy, to delve into the tradition, and to really try to live some of these concepts, because it is rich and exciting. And I think a lot of people who work in this field have had to been to a certain extent autodidacts. And so it's also, I mean, if you start reading these texts on your own and doing this work on your own, you'll in fact be in the company of professional philosophers working in Mexican philosophy, because that's the way that the field has kind of developed in recent years. So I'll just end on that optimistic note of encouragement.